She married a drifter carpenter. He was the lost son of a cattle empire returning home. The level I carry has a crack in the glass vial, right down the middle, and the bubble still floats true if you hold it just so. Eli Thorne gave it to me the day I left his shop in Sacramento, pressed it into my hand like it was a gun and not a tool, and said, "Boy, a thing that's been broken can still tell you true, long as you know where to look." I didn't understand him then. I understood him about 4 years later, standing in the Brannock barn with a hammer in my fist, and a woman watching me from the hayloft door like she already knew something about me I hadn't told her yet. I want to start there in the barn because that's where it cracked open, but a story like mine doesn't run straight. It runs the way a river runs around a thing too big to move, so bear with me. I'll get to her. I'll get to all of it. My name on the work orders, on the lumber bills, on the little tin sign I nailed above my own wagon was Cole Walker. That wasn't a lie exactly. Walker was my mother's name before she married, and I'd been walking since I was 19, so it fit close enough that I never had to think too hard about it when somebody asked. My real name is Cole Brannock Hale, and the Hale part is the one that mattered out here, because 40,000 acres of grass between the Sweetwater and the Wind River carried that name on a brand, on a bank ledger, on the side of a rail car my father had built specifically so people in 3 territories would see Hale Cattle Company rolling past and feel something, respect or fear, depending who they were. I'd been gone 6 years when I rolled my wagon up the Brannock Road with a busted axle and a toolbox full of chisels that still had my grandfather's initials stamped into the handles, because I'd kept those even when I'd thrown away everything else. The axle's what did it. Pure dumb luck, if you want to call it that, though my mother used to say there's no such thing as luck, only doors you didn't know you were walking toward. I'd been cutting north along the river road, heading nowhere particular, which had been my general direction for about 2,000 miles, when the left rear wheel hit a rut hard enough to shear a bolt clean through. I sat there in the dust with my horse looking back at me like he was disappointed, and I laughed because what else do you do? Then I heard hooves and looked up, and there she was. She didn't introduce herself first. She looked at the wagon, then the wheel, then me, in that order, like I was the least interesting part of the problem. Said, "You're not going anywhere on that till somebody welds it or you find a new bolt the size of my thumb. And there's nothing that size for 30 miles unless you want to ride into town and back, which'll take you the rest of the day." I said something about being obliged for the information. She said I didn't give it as a kindness, I gave it as a fact. Kindness is what I'll decide once I know if you're trouble. That was Margaret Brannock, Maggie to about 4 people in the world, and I wasn't one of them yet. She was riding her father's fence line because her father couldn't anymore. He'd taken a fall off a green colt 2 years prior, and his hip never sat right after. So he walked with a stick and rode in a wagon and hated both with a quiet, grinding hate he never said out loud, but you could see in the way his jaw worked when somebody offered to carry something for him. The ranch was 4,000 acres, modest by the standards I'd grown up around, but it was theirs free and clear, no bank holding paper on it, which her father said more than once like it was a psalm. Maggie ran half of it herself by then. Hired hands respected her, which I noticed before I understood why most outfits I'd passed through. A woman giving orders got smiled at and ignored till her father showed up to repeat the same order in a deeper voice. Not here. She got down off her horse, a big, ugly, capable bay gelding named Custard, for reasons nobody would ever explain to me, and looked at my busted axle like it was a puzzle she intended to win and said, "What do you do besides break wagons?" "Carpentry, joinery mostly. Some wheelwright work when a wagon forces the issue." "You any good?" I could have told her about the staircase I'd built for a senator's house in Sacramento that had a curve in it that took me 11 days to get right, the kind of curve men go to architecture school to learn and still get wrong. I could have told her about my grandfather, who built half the good barns from Cheyenne to Laramie, and taught me before he died that the difference between a carpenter and a craftsman is whether the thing still stands plumb after you're dead. I didn't tell her any of that. I said, "Good enough. We've got a barn roof that's been talking to itself in high wind for 2 winters and nobody's fixed it because Pa won't pay a man in town what he asks, and I won't let an amateur up there to fall and break his neck on my property. You fix that properly, and I'll feed you and bed your horse and pay you on top of it. Take it or keep walking." I want to tell you I had some grand internal moment right then, some premonition. I didn't. I was tired and hungry, and the offer of a roof, any roof, even when I had to fix myself first, sounded better than another night under a wagon with my hat for a pillow. I said I'd take it. She didn't smile. She just nodded once like a contract had been signed and got back up on Custard and said, "Follow the fence line, it'll take you to the house. Don't cut across the south pasture. There's a bull in there who doesn't like strangers, and frankly neither do I, so we'll see which of you proves the better company." I followed the fence line, laughing to myself, for the first time in longer than I could remember. Here's a thing about my old life I should explain plain, so you understand the size of what I was hiding. My father, Augustus Hale, built the Hale Cattle Company up from 11,000 acres his own father had homesteaded into something closer to an empire, railcars, a meatpacking interest in Omaha, a seat on 2 bank boards, more cattle moving through the Wind River basin in a season than some whole counties saw in 5 years. He was not a gentle man. He measured every person who walked into a room, including his own son, by what use they were to the operation. My older brother Garrett took to that measuring like it was the only language worth speaking. I never did. I liked the smell of cut pine more than I liked the smell of cattle, and I liked the precision of a dovetail joint more than I liked the politics of who sat where at the county cattlemen's dinner. And my father took that as a kind of betrayal he couldn't forgive, the way some men can't forgive a son for not wanting the throne. The fight that sent me out the door, I won't dress it up, was about a barn. There's some irony in that I didn't see until years later. My father wanted to tear down the old hand-hewn barn my grandfather built, the one with the joints I used to trace with my fingers as a boy, trying to understand how a man could make wood hold itself up without a single nail in the main frame, and put up a modern pole barn 3 times the size in its place, because modern was efficient, and efficient was what the operation needed. I told him the old barn was worth more standing than the new one would ever be. He told me I didn't understand what anything was worth, that I never had, that I'd spent my whole life admiring the parts of this world that didn't make money and ignoring the parts that did. And if I cared so much about old, would I should go make my living with it somewhere he didn't have to watch. So I did. I didn't take a cent of Hale money when I left. That part matters, I think, though it took me years to be proud of it instead of just bitter about it. I took my grandfather's tools, the clothes on my back, and a horse that was legally mine because I'd broken him myself as a colt. And I went west, and then I went nowhere in particular, town to town, ranch to ranch, building what people needed building, barns, porches, coffins, cradles, whatever paid, under the name Coal Walker, because Cole Hale opened doors I didn't want opened and closed others I needed shut. 6 years of that, long enough to forget the sound of my own real name in another person's mouth. Then a wheel broke on a river road, and a woman with dirt under her nails and no patience for fools told me to fix her barn roof. The Brannock house was a low, sturdy thing, built solid rather than grand white paint going gray at the edges, the way paint does on a working ranch where there's always something more urgent to fix. Her father, Walter Brannock, sat on the porch when I rode up, a shotgun across his lap that he wasn't pointing at anything in particular, which I came to understand was just where the shotgun lived, like a cat that sleeps on a particular chair. "Maggie tells me you can build," he said. "No hello. I was getting used to that family's economy with greetings." "I can." "She also tells me you're a drifter with a busted wagon, and no name worth remembering." "That's about the size of it." He looked at me a long moment. The kind of look I'd later understand was him sizing up whether I had the kind of trouble in me that follows a man, or just the kind that's behind him. "Roofs around back. Ladders in the barn already, since you'll be needing it before you need anything else from me." Which I took correctly to mean, prove it before you eat at my table. I climbed up that afternoon with my level and my saw and about 4 pounds of nails in a canvas apron, and I found the problem inside 20 minutes. A ridge beam that had been improperly seated when somebody built the thing in a hurry years back, the kind of mistake that doesn't show for a long time and then shows all at once, in high wind, as a sound like the whole structure groaning in its sleep. I could have patched it. Half the men who passed through a ranch like that would have patched it, slapped a brace across the weak point and called it fixed and collected their pay and moved on before the lie caught up with them. I didn't patch it. I pulled the bad section, recut the seating, and reset the beam properly, which took me 3 days instead of 1. And I didn't charge them for the extra time, because my grandfather's voice was in my head the whole while saying a thing that's been broken can still tell you true, long as you know where to look, And I figured if I was going to fix a roof, I was going to fix it the way he'd have fixed it, or not bother. Maggie watched part of that work. Not constantly, she had 4,000 acres of her own concerns. But she'd come up to the barn in the late afternoon sometimes with water for me, and stand at the bottom of the ladder with her hand shading her eyes, watching how I set a board, how I checked a line, the small private grammar of a man's hands when he thinks nobody important is looking. "You don't build like a drifter," she said on the second afternoon. "How does a drifter build?" "Fast and sloppy and gone before the rain tests it." She handed up the water ladle. "You build like you expect this thing to outlive you." I didn't have an answer for that, not one I could give her without giving away more than I wanted to yet, so I just said something true without being the whole truth. "My grandfather taught me. He used to say if a building falls down after you're dead, that's not bad luck, that's a confession." She looked at me a second too long after that. "That's a strange thing for a carpenter to say." My grandfather was a strange man. She almost smiled. First time I saw it, just the corner of her mouth giving a little, like a door opening half an inch before she decided whether to let it open further. Then she went back to her own work, and I went back to mine, and the roof got fixed proper, and that should have been the end of the job and the start of me moving on like I'd moved on from 40 other jobs in 40 other places. It wasn't because 3 days after the roof, a steer went through a fence in the north pasture and tore up 40 feet of rail, and Walter Brannock, sitting on his porch with his bad hip and his shotgun, said, before I'd even finished loading my wagon to leave, "You'll want to fix that before you go, won't you? Be ashamed to leave a job half done in the county." It wasn't a question. I understood that much about Walter Brannock inside a week. The man asked everything as a statement, because he'd learned a long time ago that a statement was harder to refuse than a question. I stayed. I want to tell this part honest, because there's a version of this story where a man falls for a woman in an afternoon, and that's not what happened, not with Maggie, not with me. What happened was slower and stranger, and more like building something than falling into it. I fixed the fence. Then a gate hung wrong and I fixed that. Then her father mentioned in his statement voice that the old smokehouse had a door that didn't seal right, and the meat inside was spoiling faster than it should, and I fixed that too. And by the time the smokehouse door was hung true, I'd been on the Brannock ranch 6 weeks, and I'd stopped thinking about which direction the road went after this. I learned her in pieces, the way you learn a piece of land, not in one sweep, but in the walking of it, season after season. She'd lost her mother to a fever when she was 12, and her father never remarried, not because he couldn't, but because he told me once late, over a fire with more whiskey in him than usual, that he'd loved his wife the way you love a thing you don't get twice, and he wasn't interested in a smaller version of it. Maggie had run half this ranch since she was 16 years old, doing a man's work and a woman's work both because there was nobody else to do it. And she'd had 3 different men come courting in the years since, each one circling the ranch more than they circled her, each one assuming that a woman who could rope and fence and break a horse must secretly be waiting for a man to come relieve her of all that. And each one she'd sent off with a politeness so cold it might as well have been a slammed door. They wanted a wife who happened to live on a ranch, she told me once, the 2 of us mending a section of corral fence side by side, her hands as quick with the wire as mine were with the post. "I am not a woman who happens to live on a ranch. The ranch is mine the way my own hands are mine. A man who can't see that isn't a man I've got use for." "And what is it you've got use for?" She didn't answer right away. She drove a nail with 3 clean strokes, no wasted motion, and then she said, not looking at me, "A man who builds something and means for it to last. That's rarer than you'd think." I felt that land somewhere under my ribs and didn't say anything for a while. There was a night, I'll tell it now because it matters to where this goes, about 2 months in, when a storm came down off the mountains fast and mean. The kind of storm that takes the temperature down 20 degrees in an hour and turns a calm evening into something you fight. We lost 3 head of cattle that night to a flash flood in the low pasture, swept right off their feet in water that hadn't existed 2 hours before. And Walter Brannock, who should not have been out in that weather on that hip, went out anyway because that's the kind of man he was, and his horse went down in the mud and rolled on him. I found him before Maggie did. I want that on the record, not for credit, but because of what happened after. I got him up out of the mud with his leg bent wrong below the knee, and I got him onto my own horse and walked the both of them back through rain that felt like gravel. And by the time we got to the house, Maggie was already on the porch with a lantern, already calling for the hand to ride for the doctor in town, already moving the way a person moves when they've spent their whole life being the one who handles the emergency because nobody else was going to. We got him inside. The leg was bad, not broken clean, but wrenched and swollen in a way that would keep him off it for weeks, maybe longer. And the doctor, when he finally came through the storm near dawn, said as much plain, the way doctors say things to people they think can handle plain talk. After the doctor left, after her father was finally asleep with enough laudanum in him to hold off the pain, Maggie and I sat at the kitchen table in the gray almost light before sunrise, both of us soaked through, both of us too tired to do anything but sit there with cups of coffee going cold in our hands. "You went out after him before I even knew he was gone," she said, not a question, stating it the way her father did, like she'd learned that trick from him too. "I heard the horse go down. Wasn't anything noble in it. I was just close. You carried him 3/4 of a mile through that on a horse that didn't want to be out in it either. Horse didn't have a vote." She looked at me across the table, and there was something in her face I hadn't seen before, not gratitude exactly, something with more weight to it than gratitude. "My father doesn't let men carry him, not since the fall that took his hip. He'd rather crawl. I've watched him refuse a hand up off the ground from ranch hands who have worked here 10 years. She turned her cup a quarter turn like she was checking a level. "He let you carry him 3/4 of a mile and didn't say a word against it. Maybe he didn't have the breath to argue." "He had the breath," she said it quiet certain. "He just didn't use it." She looked at me a moment longer, and then she said the thing that I think, looking back, was the real beginning of all of it, more than the wheel breaking, more than the roof, more than any of it. "I don't trust easy men, Cole Walker. I've met enough of them. They're easy because nothing's ever cost them anything. You're not easy. I don't know what it is you're carrying, but I know it's heavier than a toolbox, and I know you carry it without putting it down on other people. And that's—" She stopped herself, looked almost annoyed at her own honesty, the way a private person looks when they've said more than they planned to. "That's worth something. That's all I'm saying." I should have told her the truth that night. I think about that a lot, even now. I should have said, "My name isn't Walker. My father is Augustus Hale. I've got more land standing empty under my name than your whole ranch covers. And I walked away from every acre of it because I'd rather build a true thing with my hands than inherit a false one. And I'm not telling you this because it matters to who I am. I'm telling you because you deserve to know who's sitting across this table from you." I should have said all of it. I didn't, because the truth had a way of changing how people looked at me, and for the first time in 6 years somebody was looking at me clean, without the weight of a name attached, and I was a coward about giving that up. I told myself I'd tell her soon. I told myself that for a long time. Walter Brannock's bad leg kept him off it for the better part of 2 months, which meant I stayed the better part of 2 months, doing his work and mine both, and in that time something settled between Maggie and me that didn't need a lot of words to carry it. We worked the fence lines together. We broke a stubborn colt together, her on the lead and me on the flank, and there's a particular kind of trust that gets built between two people working a half-wild animal that won't get built any other way, because the animal will find the gap in your coordination faster than either of you will admit it's there. We didn't have a gap. We moved like we'd been doing it for years. There was an evening, late summer, the two of us up on the hill behind the house where Maggie liked to go to watch the light go down gold, and then red, and then that deep blue that isn't night yet but isn't day anymore either. And she said, out of nowhere, not looking at me, looking at the light instead, "My father asked me last week if I intended to let you keep drifting once the legs healed, or if I had sense enough to ask you to stay proper." I didn't say anything. My chest had gone tight in a way I wasn't prepared for. "I told him I hadn't decided," she said, "which was a lie I decided a while back. I just hadn't said it to you because I don't like saying a thing before I've thought all the way through what it costs." She finally looked at me, and there wasn't any softness performing in her face, just a plain, level honesty, the kind she'd give a fence post or a green colt or a problem with a roof. "I think I love you, Cole. I think I've thought that for longer than I've let myself say. And I don't know the first thing about you besides how you build, and how you carry a hurt man through a storm without complaining about the weight of him. And most days that feels like enough, and some days it scares me. Because a woman who's run her own land since she was 16 doesn't get the luxury of loving a man she doesn't understand. So I'm asking you plain because that's the only way I know how to ask anything. Who are you, under the name on your wagon? I want to tell you I answered her bravely right then. I didn't. I sat on that hill with the light going down red behind her, and I told her some of it, that I'd come from a cattle family, that there'd been a falling out with my father, that I'd taken a different name on the road because the old one came with weight I didn't want following me, but I didn't tell her the size of it. I didn't say Hale. I let her believe it was a smaller falling out than it was, a smaller name than it was, because the size of the truth scared me more than the half-lie did. She watched me say it, and there was something in her face that told me she knew I'd given her an edited version, but she didn't push. Whatever it is, she said, I'm not marrying your father's name. I'm marrying your hands and what they build. When you're ready to tell me the rest, you will. We married that autumn, in the front room of the Brannock house, with her father standing on his bad leg longer than the doctor would have liked, because he refused to sit for his only daughter's wedding, and about 30 neighbors who'd known the Brannocks for years and knew nothing at all about me except that I built true and carried weight without complaining, which around there was about the highest compliment a man could earn. I should have told her before the wedding. I told myself after would be fine, that the truth could wait until it mattered less, and that's a coward's math if I've ever heard it, because the truth doesn't get smaller waiting in a drawer, it gets bigger, the way a debt gets bigger with interest you didn't account for. It found me anyway. That's the thing about a name like Hale, it doesn't stay buried just because you bury it. It was a man named Sully who brought it, a cattle buyer who'd done business with my father's outfit for years, and recognized me across a feed store in town the way you recognize a face from a photograph you'd forgotten you'd seen. He didn't mean harm by it. I'll say that plain, because for a long while I wanted to be angry at him, and the anger wasn't honest. It was just easier than being angry at myself. He clapped me on the shoulder in front of half the county and said, loud and friendly, Cole Hale, as I live and breathe, does your father know you're out here playing Carpenter? Augustus must be tearing his hair out, his own boy gone 6 years and turned into a hired hand. The feed store went quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet when it senses a story underneath a sentence. Maggie was standing 6 feet from me with a sack of flour in her arms, and I watched her face do the math, watched the pieces fall into a shape she hadn't expected and didn't like the look of. We didn't talk about it in front of the room. We didn't talk about it on the ride home either. She drove the wagon, jaw set like granite, and I sat beside her not finding a single word that didn't sound like an excuse. It was that night in the kitchen with her father conspicuously absent because even he could read a room that she finally said it. Hale Cattle Company. She said it flat like she was reading it off a brand. 40,000 acres, a railcar with your family's name painted on the side big enough to read from a moving train, which I have personally seen Cole more than once and never once thought to connect to the man hanging my barn door. She wasn't shouting. I almost wish she had been. The quiet was worse. You let me think your trouble was small, a falling out, a name you'd rather not carry. You didn't tell me the trouble was an empire, and you were the man who walked away from inheriting it. Would it have changed anything? That's not the question, and you know it isn't. Her voice cracked there just slightly, the only crack I'd ever heard in it. The question is why you'd let me marry a man and not tell him who I was marrying. I stood in that front room and said vows to Cole Walker. I find out a week later there's a Cole Hale underneath him I never met, never got asked about, never got a vote on whether I wanted. She set the flour sack down hard enough that a little white cloud came up off it. I don't care about the money if that's what you're bracing for. I've turned down men with twice my acreage because I didn't like the way they talked to their own hired help. I care that you decided, all on your own, what I could handle knowing. That's not a small thing, Cole. That's the exact thing I told you on that hill, that I was afraid of loving a man I didn't understand. You took my fear and built right into the middle of it and didn't tell me you'd done it. I didn't have a defense for that because there wasn't one. I told her the whole of it that night, finally, no editing. My father, my brother, the barn, the fight, the 6 years. The reason I'd let Cole Walker eat my real name like a snake swallowing its own tail. She listened without interrupting, arms crossed, jaw tight. And when I finished, she didn't say it was all right, because it wasn't, and she wasn't a woman who'd hand out forgiveness like it was free just to smooth a hard moment over. I need a few days, she said. Not to decide if I still love you. I know that answer already, and being angry doesn't change it. I need a few days to decide if I can trust a man who's already shown me he'll keep something this size in his pocket if he thinks it's easier than handing it over. She looked at me steady, the same look she'd given that busted wagon wheel the first day, sizing up a problem she intended to solve on her own terms and nobody else's. Don't follow me around the place asking if I've decided yet. I'll tell you when I have. So I gave her the days. I kept building. There's always something on a working ranch that needs a man's hands. And I needed the work the way some men need a drink, just to keep my own thoughts from eating me alive. And I didn't push. And on the fourth day, Walter Brannock found me in the barn reshimming a stall door that didn't need reshimming, busy work. The kind a man does when his hands need an excuse to keep moving. You know what my daughter told me, he said, lowering himself onto an overturned bucket with the careful economy of a man whose hip has taught him exactly how much it'll forgive. About the name. I expect she did. She also told me you carried me 3/4 of a mile through a flood without putting me down once to rest your arms, even though I know for a fact you must have wanted to, because I'm not a small man, and that was not a small storm. He looked at me with that same long, sizing look from the first day, except there was something different in it now, something that had decided. A man who'll do that for a stranger's father, and then go 6 years pretending he's got no father worth claiming at all, that's a man running from something, not a man who's nothing underneath. I don't much care what your name says on a railcar, son. I care what it says when you've got a hurt man's weight on your back and a storm telling you to drop him. He stood, slow, leveraging himself up off the bucket. She'll come around. Give her room. And when she does, you tell her every last thing, start to finish, and you don't ever again decide on her behalf what she's strong enough to carry. She's carried this whole ranch since she was 16. She can carry the truth. What she can't carry is a man who thinks she can't. He left me alone with that, and it sat in me a long while. On the 7th day, Maggie found me up in the hayloft, where I'd gone to mend tack because my hands needed a small, precise job to keep from shaking. She climbed the ladder slow, and I heard her before I saw her. And when she came up over the edge into the loft light, she stood there a moment, looking at me the way she'd looked at me from the bottom of that ladder the second day I'd ever worked on her father's roof, hand shading her eyes, even though there wasn't much sun up there to shade against, like it was a habit more than a need. I went and saw your father, she said. That landed in my chest like a dropped beam. You did what? I rode out to the Hale place. 3 days' ride there and back, which is why you haven't seen me since Tuesday, and not because I was sulking in my room, in case you'd convinced yourself of that. She came and sat on a hay bale across from me, businesslike, the way she sat to discuss a fence line or a sick calf. I wanted to see the empire myself. I wanted to see what kind of place makes a man hide his own name rather than carry it. What did you find? I found a big, cold house and a big, cold man who looked at me like I was a line item in a ledger he hadn't approved yet. She said it without heat, just reporting. I told him who I was. I told him I'd married his son under a different name because his son was apparently more afraid of him than he was of anything else in this world, including telling the truth to the woman he loved. Your father did not enjoy hearing that, Cole. Your brother Garrett was there too, older, harder around the eyes than you, looked at me the way men look at a horse there deciding whether to buy or pass on. She paused. Your father asked me how much land the Brannock Ranch carries. I told him 4,000 acres, free and clear, no bank paper on a single one of them. He laughed at that, said it like it was a small, foolish thing. Her jaw set the granite look. I told him my father built that ranch with his own hands and never once needed 40,000 acres to know what he was worth, and that I'd rather marry a carpenter who built true with no land at all than inherit an empire from a man who measures his own son by a number on a deed. I didn't say anything. I couldn't for a second. I'm not telling you this to be cruel about your father, she said, gentler now. I'm telling you because I needed to see it with my own eyes before I could be properly angry at you for running from it instead of just angry at you for hiding it. I understand now what you were running from. I still think you were wrong not to tell me. Both things are true at once, and I've had 3 days in a saddle to make peace with holding both of them. She looked at me straight on. So here's where I am, Cole. I'm not interested in being Mrs. Hale of the Cattle Empire. I never will be, and if that's what you think you owe that family someday, you'd best say so now, because that's not the life I built my hands for. But I am interested in being married to a man who tells me the truth before it walks into a feed store ahead of him. Can you be that man? Not the rich one, not the poor one either, the running one, just the honest one. That's the only thing I'm asking you to build from here. I can be that man, I said, and it came out rougher than I meant it to because 6 years of practiced quiet doesn't unmake itself in one sentence, but I meant every word of it the way I mean a level line, checked, certain, no room left for doubt once it's set. I should have been him from the start. I wasn't because I was scared of what you'd see once you saw the whole of it, and I let that fear make the choice instead of letting you make it. That won't happen again. Not because I'm promising it in a hayloft, because it's the easy thing to say up here. Because I've had 7 days to feel what it costs to lose the way you used to look at me, and I'm not interested in losing it twice. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she reached over and took the level out of my toolbox, the cracked one, Eli Thorne's level, the one I'd carried since Sacramento, and held it up to the loft's crossbeam, checking it the way I'd taught her without either of us meaning to teach or learn anything, just from working alongside each other long enough that her hands had started picking up my habits the way mine had started picking up hers. "It's true," she said, meaning the beam, meaning more than the beam. "It generally is once you've checked it twice." She set the level down and crossed the loft floor and put her hand flat against my chest, right over the heartbeat, the way you'd check whether a wall was solid before you trusted your weight against it. "I married a man I thought had nothing behind him but a toolbox and a horse he'd broken himself," she said. "Turns out he had an empire behind him and walked away from every acre of it because it asked him to be somebody he wasn't. I think that's worth more than the 40,000 acres, Cole. I think that's worth more than anything your father's railcar has ever carried. I just need you to believe that too, instead of believing the only thing you're worth is what you can build with your hands while you're hiding from your name." She looked up at me, steady, no softness performing, just the plain, honest weight of her. "You don't have to keep hiding here, not from me. Not anymore." I put my arms around her then, in that hayloft, with afternoon light coming through the gaps in the boards in long gold bars across the hay. And she let herself be held the way a woman lets herself be held when she's decided fully, on her own terms and nobody else's, that this is a place she means to stay standing. We didn't go back to the Hale Ranch. Not for years, not until my father was old and sick, and Garrett had run the company into a kind of brittle, joyless efficiency that finally cracked under its own weight the way a beam cracks when it's never been properly seated. And even then we went because Maggie said a man ought to see his father one more time before the ground takes the choice away from him, not because either of us wanted the land. We never took an acre of it. We didn't need to. The Brannock Ranch grew under our 2 sets of hands, hers in the saddle, mine in the timber, into something smaller than an empire and truer than 4,000 acres that never once needed a number on a deed to know what it was worth. I still carry that cracked level. The bubble still floats true. Eli Thorne was right about more than he probably knew when he handed it to me. A thing that's been broken can still tell you true, long as you know where to look, and I reckon that goes for levels and for men both, and most of all it goes for a man lucky enough to find a woman who'll hold the broken thing up to the light herself, check it twice, and decide it's still worth trusting. Some evenings, late, Maggie and I climb that same hill behind the house to watch the light go down gold, and then red, and then that deep blue that isn't night yet. And she leans against me the way you lean against something you've already tested and found solid, and I put my arm around her, and neither one of us says much, because by then there isn't much left that needs saying out loud. We built this, plumb and level, and meant to outlive us both.